From the studios of Farm Journal Broadcast, this is U.S. Farm Report.
Welcome to U.S. Farm Report this weekend. I'm Tyne Morgan, and here's what's in store over the next 60 minutes. Wane interest rate cuts.
Fed's job is very straightforward.
And there's more troubling signs in the ag economy as Iowa farmland values drop for the first time in 5 years. A glut of grapes.
Biggest challenge is finding a home for fruit, which is still unsold as of August 8th.
The complex battle California grape growers face as wine demand declines. And in Nebraska, the Sand Hills make up a quarter of the state.
Stop number 3 in the Trust in Beef Sustainable Ranchers Tour brings us here to the Sand Hills of Nebraska.
That area features a fragile landscape and one that's trying to be preserved. Now for the news, Wall Street spent the week trying to bounce back from Monday when it had its worst day in nearly 2 years, with concerns about a recession remaining as some analysts say the Federal Reserve has kept interest rates too high for too long. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago president trying to reassure investors following Monday's market chaos that spilled over into the livestock market. But don't expect an emergency Fed meeting to cut interest rates. He says it's not the panel's job to pump up the market.
Fed's job is very straightforward. Maximize employment, stabilize prices, and maintain financial stability. If the conditions collectively start coming in that on the through line, there's deterioration on any of those parts, we're going to fix it.
But last week's report of 0.2 percentage point unemployment increase caught the market's attention, sparking those recession fears. The Fed has another meeting scheduled for about 6 weeks from now, and some analysts believe it could cut rates then. Those higher interest rates having an impact on farmland values right now. 2 ag lenders saying for the first time in 5 years, values actually declined in Iowa. Farm Credit Services of America and Frontier Farm Credit releasing its benchmark farmland values report. They say since January, land values have made modest gains in eastern Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Wyoming. While in Iowa, the value of cropland has declined overall 2.4%. But they say despite the pullback, Iowa's real estate values are up nearly 60% since 2019. And across all 5 states they serve, values remain at or near record levels. Well, Reuters reporting the EPA is investigating at least 2 renewable fuel producers. It says the agency is looking into the supply chains of the companies out of concerns they may be using fraudulent feedstocks for biodiesel. It comes following a surge in used cooking oil exports from Asia. However, the EPA is not naming the companies right now. EPA says it cannot discuss ongoing enforcement action. However, the audits have been ongoing since July of 2023 in response to a 2020 lawsuit by U.S. biofuels groups. The groups had suspected fraudulent use of separated food waste for biofuels production, and that's why they initiated a lawsuit. They asked EPA to provide traceability of the feedstocks used for biodiesel and renewable diesel production for producers earning credits under the renewable fuels standards. That included used cooking oil.
These are rules that EPA proposed in 2020 and that we negotiated with the EPA to finalize in 2022. So we were on notice as soon as those regulations were finalized that EPA would begin auditing.
The production of biodiesel from used cooking oil can earn refiners, states, and federal tax subsidies under the RFS. The fear was some of these supplies and imports were virgin palm oil, which is cheaper and less sustainable. Vice President Kamala Harris has picked her running mate for the presidential election. It's Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. The 60-year-old has been governor of Minnesota since 2018. He previously served 6 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was born in West Point, Nebraska, served in the Army National Guard, and then worked as a teacher. In Congress, Walz focused on veterans issues and ag policy. The selection of Walz is seen as a strategic move to appeal to both rural and progressive voters. But some farmers say Walz has actually been bad for rural Minnesota. Experts say Walz was ag-friendly while serving on the House Ag Committee and as a governor, but some farmers say that's simply not true. Farm Journal's Michelle Rook spoke with the president of Minnesota Soybean Growers Association. He says while Walz has supported biofuels, the organization did face a battle with him in the state legislature when he tried to push a low carbon fuel standard in Minnesota, similar to California's low carbon fuel standard.
There's definitely some aspects of it that, yeah, he has been farmer friendly. Have we completely agreed with everything that he has done? Absolutely not. But like I said, we have always been allowed to have the seat at the table and let farmers have discussions with him about everything moving in our policy.
Tropical storm Debbie spawning a deadly tornado, causing life-threatening flooding this week. We will have a check of your forecast coming up next.
U.S. Farm Report is brought to you by Pioneer.
Ben's bins, please hold.
Yeah, Ben's has been busy all day.
Seems like no one can keep up with this new Z series. What did you all put in these feeds?
Science.
U.S. Farm Report weather is brought to you by H&S Manufacturing. Maximize baleage yield with less time and effort with the LW1100 line wrap bale wrapper. You can wrap round or square bales, and the automatic operating mode allows for a one-person operation.
The remains of Hurricane Debbie leaving a mark this week. Historic rains slamming South Carolina and states all along the East Coast. While the damage is severe, the silver lining is the fact the East did see some major improvements in the latest drought monitor. Jack Van Meter joining us now with weather. Jack?
As we check in on the new updates on the drought monitor that came out this week, we actually unfortunately don't see all that many changes. As we take a look around the country, we can see actually good news is from the south going through the Midwest and parts of the plains as well, we're not seeing any noticeable dryness whatsoever. So that is good news. On the flip side of that coin, we are seeing some dryness, especially out here in West Virginia, out on the eastern seaboard. But good news there is tropical system Debbie will be making its way through this weekend and into early next week. Should alleviate some of those drought problems as well. As we can see, though, still dry in Texas and Montana especially, and much of the Northwest is very dry. Again, that's why they're dealing with those fire hazards out there. As we can see, excessive rainfall the next 7 days it's going to be pretty wet, especially down south and in the middle of the plains here, a little bit in Kansas and Oklahoma, especially as we can see, expect actually quite a lot of rain, even close to 2 inches, maybe even 3 inches at times. And most of that is going to be contributed to thunderstorm downpour. So it's something to keep in mind for that. Now the jet stream is going to be changing throughout the weekend. We have this trough that is forming, this low pressure system up here in Canada, really dipping those heights down, and what that's doing is it's bringing cold air in from Canada, cold or cooler air in from Canada, and really cooling down the northern part of the country, especially today and moving into the rest of the week. As I put this in motion, that low pressure system finally moves out, but unfortunately we are seeing another pattern emerge that we've seen time and time again this summer, and it's going to be that heat ridge building in the middle part of the country, especially situated by Texas. We can see these really high temperatures and high heights really just forcing the jet stream well up, forcing that ridge to set in once again. And when we have these situations coming into play, we are going to be seeing that high pressure and high heat as well. And that's because what it's doing really is blocking out all the available chances of rainfall for the rest of the week. As we can see, that's what's going to be setting up in the week. And as a result of that, we're going to be very dry, especially where I just said down in Texas, where that high pressure is going to be situated, blocking all chances for precipitation though. But good news is, looks like much of the country is actually going to be seeing a little bit above average chances of precipitation. Take a look at temperatures, same deal there. You can expect this from that ridge and see where it's really situated as well, especially down in Texas. It's spanning all the way north.
Thanks, Jack. Well, with rains and cooler temps in the Midwest, is the crop only getting bigger? That's what we'll debate with Naomi Bloom and Matt Bennett coming up next. Welcome back to U.S. Farm Report this weekend. Naomi Bloom as well as Matt Bennett joining us. All right, we've got to talk about the stock market this week and the impact it had on commodities, because concerns about the ag economy, the jobs market, spooked the stock market, saw a massive drop, but we did have a relief rally after the jobless claims data. But Naomi, when you look at the impact that the stock market had on commodities this week, what do we need to watch in the weeks ahead?
The biggest thing that traders are going to be watching for is curiosity to see if money flow coming out of the stock market maybe can come into commodities. So we're hopeful that because commodity prices are relatively cheap compared to where we've been for the past few years, that maybe some of the money flow comes into commodities, we see a little bit of a boost. However, that battles the current storyline of the grain markets, which that supplies are sufficient and ending stocks continue to grow.
Yeah, and it seems like that story is not going away. Crop consultant Dr. Michael Cordonier raising his corn and yield forecast, or soybean yield forecast this week, half a bushel for each of those. So now his corn yield forecast 182 bushels per acre, soybean 52.5 bushels per acre. We have a big USDA report coming up next week. Matt, do you expect USDA to adjust yield?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely do. Whenever you look at the historics here in August, they always make some sort of a change. You've got to ask yourself, which direction might it be? Clearly, the good to excellent ratings would certainly lend credence to both corn and beans should move a little bit higher. When you look at the drought monitor, there's just no caller to speak of. I understand that parts of Kansas, parts of Ohio, they've certainly had a little bit drier bias than everyone else, but in the heart of the Corn Belt, the ice states, if you will, into Nebraska, I know Minnesota's had a lot of rain early on, but bottom line is we don't have much in the way of that drought. So I've got to think that it's going to go up. Our group actually came in with 183.2. I know it's not the highest number, but it's one of the higher numbers. We feel pretty strongly that both corn and beans would move up. For beans, we're 52.7. So bottom line is, we think that we're going to take both of these a little bit higher. I know August is the bean month for the beans, but bottom line is I think you got to move up.
It isn't perfect everywhere. I mean, you look at the coast right now dealing with the remnants of the hurricane, some flooding out there. You mentioned the pockets of drought. But Naomi, you look at how great the weather is in the core of the Corn Belt right now. Do you feel this crop is only getting bigger?
I do, Tyne. I feel like we're not hearing producers complain about how things are negative, and they're pretty quiet, but thankful for how things are actually looking positive. So I do feel that on Monday's USDA report, we likely see the USDA raise the yield. Now, the question is, do they just do a baby step to acknowledge the good crop out there, or are they going to do something larger? They're going to be using satellite imagery and farmer survey to get these numbers. So we are expecting, and trade is expecting, higher yield. But the question will be if there's any adjustment to harvested acres, because we are going to be able to incorporate the FSA and RMA numbers into this report. And that might be something that provides some curiosity for the market or a surprise to the marketplace. But the bottom line is, what do all the adjustments do to ending stocks? And we still have 2 billion bushel carryout for corn and over 400 million bushels on the beans. It's a big crop. And those are really, really, really big supply numbers overall.
That acreage piece, we could see some changes. We're going to talk about that in a second. But first, Naomi, what do you feel like the market is trading at this point? What yield?
I would say that we are above the USDA 181, probably trading 182 on the beans. And then on the corn. And then on the beans, I feel like we're about 52.5, which is above the USDA number of 52.
Yeah, and both of those numbers are what Dr. Michael Cordonier came out with this week. Matt, what do you think the market is trading?
I would say something similar. It's a little bit early, I think, for us to drastically move lower. In my opinion, not only do you need to be seeing what they're forecasting, see what the thermal imaging maps look like, but getting into harvest, I think, is whenever you could maybe safely move below $4 if the crop is as big as what some people think.
Okay, well, it sounds like we are anticipating USDA to raise yields in the report next week, but possibly could we see an acreage surprise? Naomi kind of hinted at that, but we're going to talk about that when we come back. Welcome back. Well, Naomi hinted at this in our last roundtable, but USDA kind of setting the stage with a notice that they could adjust acres in this August report that is coming out next week. And so, Naomi, when you look at that, possibly, what if we do see a reduction in acres? How would the market react to that?
Well, the reduction in acres, I think, is a viable thing because of the prevent plant that we're likely going to be seeing from Minnesota with as wet of a spring that they had, and portions of South Dakota and that Northwest Iowa corridor. Really, really soggy conditions. So the market is already anticipating that we might see a little bit of reduced harvested acres, but the question of how much is really what's out there, because when you also shift over to the soybean market, when they put out that June 30th acreage number, we still had soybeans to plant because of the double crop wheat getting harvested and then had to get the beans in the ground. So there's could be a lot of surprises on here, and I think just be ready for anything to unfold.
Yeah, Matt, what are your expectations with acreage, and what are some of these pre-report expectations coming out as we head into this report next week?
Yeah, I think clearly the USDA has got something in store. They wouldn't announce we're going to do this a month earlier than normal. Could there be a big reduction in acres? I don't know about a big reduction. When we stop and think about the folks that would have been reporting the latest, it would have been the ones that had such an issue getting a crop in the ground. So maybe you get a little bit of a revision lower as far as corn acreage goes. But me and my team feel pretty confident that even if you get that reduction, you're probably going to still take total production higher due to the fact that yield is likely to move higher. So, I don't look for anything outlandish, but as Naomi said, I don't think you can ever underestimate what a USDA report can do. Sometimes these August reports can be awfully volatile, and so I'd be prepared for anything, like Naomi said.
Okay, and we could also see some changes to demand. So Naomi, when you look at this week, old and new crop soybean sales during the week ending August 1st surpassed analysts' pre-report expectations, but new crop corn was below pre-report expectations. So knowing that we have seen some sales coming up, could we see USDA adjust the demand side?
I would be skeptical if they did, because they did that in the last couple of reports. And I feel like with the lower prices that we've been seeing for new crop, they already increased demand for exports, anticipating more export demand because prices have gone down. So with the flurry of export sales that we've seen recently, really all it's doing is getting us on track for where we should be for USDA projections. So the good news, other countries are buying our product, but I think other countries are waiting to see how low our prices could go here in the United States. And then also keeping an eye on geopolitics, keeping an eye on our elections. So there could be more export activity to come. I really would be skeptical that the USDA does any major changes on Monday's report, though.
Yeah, Matt, do you agree with that sentiment?
Yeah, I do actually. To me, I thought that the July report, the USDA was, quite gracious when it gets right down to it about how much demand they injected into new crop balance sheets. Both corn and beans, you're looking at awfully strong demand that is being implied at this point. I thought that the July report was friendly in other ways as well, due to implied usage, maybe on that June 30th report, not quite matching up with July's USDA report. So I don't expect any changes to demand here. I think that most of the changes you're going to see are clearly going to be with regards to production.
All right, a lot to watch in next week's report. Matt, Naomi, thank you so much for joining us. So we need to take a quick break, and then we're checking in with Machinery Pete for Tractor Tales next.
Hey, welcome back to Tractor Tales, folks. This week we're going to head to Illinois to check out an International 826.
It's an 826 gear drive. I've had it 30 years and it's been around here. I did paint it one other time, but I went ahead and I went through everything on it and got it all done when I'm semi-retired here. And I've always grown up on International tractors. That's what my dad and my granddad had. So I was comfortable with them. My dad actually had one just like this one when I bought this. I like just driving them. It's everything to power. You can see good with it. It works good for me. Loader tractor, I do a little bit on some ground I have here. I'll do some seeding with it and stuff like that.
Talk about this front loader you got on it.
I put that on right after I bought the tractor. I went to a local dealership here, and that's what they handled. And I told him what I wanted it for, and he suggested getting this one, and it's worked really good. It's been a good loader. It had a new clutch in it just about 3 or 4 years ago and a new torque. I put new bearings and bushings in the front end, new spindles, new drag links, the steering arms, put all that in. Got a new seat, new steering wheel. I did it during COVID, So it probably took longer than most because it was so hard to get parts.
Somebody wants to buy it, would you sell it?
I don't think so. I don't think so. It's going to be around a while.
Thanks, Greg. Well, wine grape growers across California are left with no market for their fruit this year. We'll tell you what's causing the glut of grapes. And later, the key to preserving the sandhills of Nebraska just may be raising cattle.
You're watching U.S. Farm Report. Trusted, timely, tradition.
It's not just row crop farmers dealing with challenges and low prices. In California, from nuts to fruits, prices are low and financial stress is weighing heavily on farmers. For grape growers, the situation is a bit unique. Declining demand for wine and an increase in imported wine means there's a glut of grapes this year. And it's so bad, there's a surge in the amount of unharvested grapes that still don't have a home. Now there are fears it could ultimately force more true family farmers out of business. The fifth generation to farm in her family.
I think it's incredibly rare.
Jennifer Thompson is one of the few family farmers still left in Napa Valley.
When you truly meet a family grower who is hands-on and drives their own tractor and is responsible for selling their own fruit and is responsible for paying the taxes on the land, and there's no middleman involved, that's a rarity in 2024.
Thompson bought this land from her uncle and grandfather, taking over in 2012. And this year, it's a healthy crop.
The crop, at least at our ranches, looks mildew-free, looks like it sized up nicely.
Battling different weather each year, she says this year there actually haven't been too many speed bumps in the road. Yet these vines aren't as full as they'd normally be.
I made some key decisions during pruning to reduce the crop load as a benefit or in conjunction with this being a sluggish grape selling market.
In December of last year, Thompson got some gut-wrenching news.
But ultimately, all of our contracts were canceled on December 31st, 2023.
All of them.
All of them with the exception of one.
Thompson's vineyards produce just under 300 tons of grapes each year. And for the first time in more than a decade, 2/3 of it is without a home.
I have found limited and very small homes. And by that, I mean, am I able to sell 2 to 8 tons here or there? Yes. But our parcels produce hundreds of tons worth of grapes.
Walking these vineyards and staring at young, healthy vines loaded with unsold grapes is a flashback to what area vineyards saw 11 to 12 years ago.
During sort of the dot-com era and the financial bust of 2008 and 2009, this sort of same or similar pattern occurred in the marketplace where wineries canceled all contracts across the board for many growers, or even those growers who had contracts were told, do not deliver those grapes to our winery.
4% of California's wine production happens here in Napa Valley, but its value is higher. And about 60 miles east, grape growers in Lodi, California are faced with the same dilemma.
Our community is multi-generational farming families that, their families have been farming grapes for over 100 years. And so their whole identity is wrapped up in growing grapes. And so it's really hitting some of our people hard.
20% of California's total wine production comes from Lodi, home to 100,000 acres of grapes. Executive Director of the Lodi Wine Grape Commission, Stuart Spencer, says the issue is both too much supply and dwindling demand.
We were fortunate in our industry and in the United States to have about 30 years of positive growth, year after year growth. And, one of the challenges with growth is it tends to hide the problems and challenges.
He says the U.S. wine market started to see demand flatten in 2018 as the baby boomer generation grew older.
And then we went into the pandemic, and the pandemic really distorted sales and shipments. And we are still dealing with the hangover of the distortions from the pandemic.
As consumers bought more wine, beer, and spirits during the pandemic, they also beefed up their inventories. But now they're cutting back. And with inflation and other concerns in the economy, consumers are simply drinking less wine as well.
It's pushed, the inventory back upstream, basically, to the wineries, who then turn around and cut grape purchases to the growers.
Spencer says there's also been an anti-alcohol sentiment in the news over the past year.
One of the problems we see there is, they're not differentiating between, abuse and healthy use. And you had the World Health Organization come out with saying no level of alcohol is safe. And so a lot of these things are kind of in a backdrop that's really putting pressure on wine.
With the decline in demand, Spencer says it came to a head during last year's harvest.
A lot of our growers in the Lodi area operate on what are called long-term contracts. And, many of the large wine companies were using every kind of loophole in the contracts to get out of purchasing grapes and using quality parameters and things like that really put pressure on the growers.
He says estimates show 400,000 tons of grapes went unharvested last year in California. And there are fresh fears this year could be even worse.
One of the real frustrating things for the growers in California is that our largest buyers and the top 7 wineries control about 70% of the U.S. wine market. And, over the last 20 years, they've evolved into kind of what we call global alcohol companies. And so they're no longer just sourcing California grapes and just selling wine.
As imports increase, it's another challenge for California's grape growers who have no home for some of their grapes. And the prices they're being paid haven't gone up as much as costs to produce a ton of grapes.
We were being paid $2,000 to $2,500 a ton back in 1998. Maybe in current times, in 2023, 2024, for sparkling wine grapes, we're being paid $2,850 to $2,900. And that's really only a 10% increase over 20 years or more.
Thompson says at the same time, her costs are up anywhere from 30 to 50%. Still, the toil Thompson has dedicated to this land is 5 generations deep, and she hopes there's still a group of consumers that want a connection to the wine they drink.
I really do feel that there is a group out there that are millennials who are really getting into collecting wine, or they have that authentic need to connect. There's an opportunity in the industry, and I think that the smart wineries will capitalize on that. The question will be for us as family farmers, how long can we wait for them to discover this? And so I just would ask for people in the Midwest or wherever you might be across the United States, like, when we say get to know your farmer, we really mean, even in the wine industry, know who the farmer is behind those grapes and know who the winemaker is.
The biggest question from grape growers and those in the industry is, why aren't legislators stepping in? What's being called a dirty secret is the fact that 20 million gallons of imported bulk wine poured into California in just the first 5 months of the year, all while a large portion of California's grapes, as you just saw, don't have a home. Some argue that the government stepping in with tariffs on imported bulk wine would actually help save family farmers. Well, other big news on the trade front this week, the U.S. refusing to tighten trade ties with Vietnam. That's in Ag Around the World next. Now for a glimpse of Ag Around the World. The U.S. is rejecting Vietnam's bid to have a market economy status. The classification could have boosted exports and cut tariffs on goods from the country, and that is becoming a supply chain alternative to China. But the Department of Commerce citing several reasons for maintaining Vietnam's classification as a non-market economy, saying that despite economic reforms, there is still extensive government involvement in Vietnam's economy. This includes control over pricing, currency, and trade practices. Without the market economy status, goods from Vietnam are subject to higher anti-dumping duties, making them less competitive in the U.S. market. And food prices around the world eased a bit in July. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization says the food price index had a reading of 120.8 in July. That's down 0.2% from June. It says the decrease was driven by lower cereal grain prices and comes despite an increase in meat, vegetable oils, and sugar prices. The organization says dairy prices remain steady while meat prices increased by 1.5%. The index is now 3% lower than it was a year ago and more than 24% off its peak in March of 2022. Well, is agriculture here in the U.S. on the brink of a recession? Chip's Corner is next. Here now with Chip Flory for Chip's Corner. Chip, JP Morgan saying that they think the chances of a U.S. recession by the end of the year are now 35%.
Right.
That is up from the 25% that they previously were forecasting. I mean, there's some nervousness that impacted the market this week, thoughts that the U.S. may enter a recession. But in agriculture, there's a question right now. Are we on the brink of an ag recession, or are we already in a recession? I know it's something that you've been talking about on your show as well.
Oh, absolutely. Spending quite a bit of time talking about it. And when we are in a situation when net farm income is going to be off somewhere between 25 and 30% year on year, that's going to have an impact on the overall economy, the overall ag economy, and the ability of spending to generate some economic activity. So we talked about it quite a bit this past week. We had Jim Mintert from Purdue University on talking about the ag economy barometer, and we took that conversation straight into our weekly farmer forum, in which Tim Burak, a farmer from Arlington, Iowa, had this to say when I asked him, is the ag economy already in a recession?
I think we are. When you look at the John Deere layoffs, the Firestone layoffs, everything that's going on, and the lack of machinery moving, ag's in a recession. A lot of people don't realize it yet. I'm sure the politicians don't. They're so busy looking the other way, telling us how great things are. But yeah, I think we are. And I think the country's starting down. And I was with some international farmers last week, and I kept asking, are we in a world recession? And a lot of different farmers from around the world are questioning what's happening because of their prices.
Okay, it's interesting to hear Tim say that he thinks we already are in an ag recession, because when you look at the ag economy barometer that came out from Purdue, you mentioned you had Jim Mintert on, and those sentiments, farmer sentiments, actually climbed this month. Why?
Showed some surprising optimism in the July survey numbers. That survey was taken during the Republican National Convention. It was taken just a couple of days after a failed assassination attempt on former President Trump. There was a bit of a surge in a positive attitude in the middle of the country at that time, and that may be why the ag economy barometer showed some of that optimism, Tyne.
Okay, that makes sense, because that caught me off guard. I think it caught you off guard. Did it catch Jim Mintert off guard too?
Yes, absolutely. He said it caught him a little bit flat-footed, maybe looking for a bit of a correction in that outlook in the August update.
Yeah, because you ask any farmer right now, the sentiment is definitely not positive, at least on the row crop side. Chip Flory,
That's right.
You can catch him weekdays, 10 a.m. or 2 p.m. for AgriTalk AM and AgriTalk PM. All right, we need to come back. And then there's an effort in Nebraska to save the sandhills, but they're doing so with cattle. We'll tell you that story when we come back. If you stripped away all the grass in the sandhills of Nebraska, you'd have nothing but desert. That's what makes cattle production the ideal way to utilize that land. Michelle Rook takes us to the site of the latest stop on the Trust in Beef Sustainable Ranchers Tour to see the regenerative practices ranchers are using to sustain this area for the future.
Ranchers here in the sandhills of Nebraska are preserving and sustaining this unique ecological region for the future through their many conservation and regenerative practices.
The sandhills makes up nearly a quarter of the state.
It's a one-of-a-kind ecosystem, as the fragility of the sandy soil makes it nearly unsuitable for the cultivation of crops.
The sandhills is the largest temperate grassland, just the most intact temperate grassland remaining in the world.
To preserve this natural resource for the future, ranchers like Homer Buell are using regenerative practices, which also ensure the profitability and livelihood of his ranch.
It's a fragile landscape, but if you treat it right, and it can be very productive and produce grass. And really the only use for something like the sandhills, primarily, I mean, you have a few pivots here and there, but it's primarily just the native grasses grazed by some type of livestock.
The ranch dates back to 1883 and spans nearly 15,000 acres, divided into nearly 69 subpastures with permanent fencing and water.
Our pasture size runs anywhere from a half section down to maybe 200 acres. And maybe even a little less than that.
That enables them to rotate cattle often and allows adequate rest time for the grass. It's promoted biodiversity in various warm and cool season species, so they have forage year-round and can manage through drought.
One of the main things is to move cattle. Early in the part of the summer, we don't probably have any cattle that stay more than 4 or 5 days in one pasture, and then they move on, and we'll graze a little longer, maybe a week and a half or whatever later in the summer.
Buell says they use the Texas A&M Grazing Manager program to create grazing plans and stocking rates for the 1,600 yearlings and cows they're running.
And then we adjust that based upon rainfall. And we make sure we don't overgraze at any one time, and then use that program to track how we're affecting the land over time.
And since the sandhills don't produce hard grass, they've had to adapt their breeding program to compensate.
You've got to have cattle that have a lot of capacity so they can eat a lot of grass.
The Shovel Dot Ranch also has to continually manage one of the biggest threats to their grassland, which is cedar tree encroachment. The loss of grasslands has been escalating the last 2 decades as this native and now invasive species has spread from the south to the northern plains.
There's nothing else that has that kind of big picture impact to our production, our entire ecosystem, because you're literally losing your grassland.
In fact, Nebraska producers are losing up to 420,000 tons of grassland annually to eastern red cedars.
They remove that grassland resource, and so you're talking about a 75% loss of carrying capacity.
Ranchers can improve on that with prevention, but if they have to eradicate, it's most effective when cedars are low in density. But it's expensive, even with a 75% cost share from the Sandhills Task Force.
So you start doing the math, that's like $1,000 per acre for 1,000 acres. That's $1 million, and why that cost share is so important.
And ranchers are also collaborating on control.
Some are even doing prescribed burns as a collective group, burning across multiple properties. Others are using mechanical or just managing that fence line.
Even without woody plants, the large swings in moisture can make it tough to produce enough grass in the sandhills, even with proper grazing management.
One of the things that is kind of a perennial challenge is matching the number of animals with the amount of forage that's out here.
The other big threat to grasslands in Nebraska is row crop conversion.
So as we lose that, we lose a lot of our biodiversity. It's really hard after you've converted the land from rangeland to cropland to bring that biodiversity back, even if you were to plant it back into grass.
While grassland management aids in sustainability, Nebraska ranchers must also manage costs and remain profitable.
We're getting down to the nuts and bolts of analyzing that data. How can we increase cattle production without increasing cattle numbers? Or how can we better our land without increasing our acres or throwing on additional fertilizers?
And I think that's sustainable. If you can show and benchmark and collect data that you are getting better every year, I think that's a huge part of the sustainability story.
The long-term goal is to preserve the sandhills and their way of life for the future.
So sustainability for us is just keeping the 5th generation here, the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th. And we try to make all our decisions based upon long-term what will be good for everything we manage on this ranch.
I'm Michelle Rook for U.S. Farm Report.
Thanks, Michelle. Well, it's a barn that's more than a barn. It's now iconic. From the Farm is next. Well, when is a barn more than a barn? Well, when it turns into something iconic. That's just what happened to this barn in Leroy, New York. The city is the birthplace of that familiar treat, Jello, and recently the 204-year-old barn was given a bit of a paint job, as John Kutchko shows us.
It is one of the finest barns, not just in Western New York, but really, in my view, in all of America. The 1820 Jello Barn here in Leroy got a fresh repainting over the weekend, and it looks absolutely spectacular.
John and Sue Demling have owned the Jello Barn in Genesee County for years. It was back in 2013 when they decided to paint old-style advertising on it. On one side was the nostalgic tobacco ad seen on thousands of barns across America beginning in the late 1800s. And on the other side was a celebration of Leroy's distinction as being the birthplace of America's favorite dessert. That would be Jello. They first painted it this way 11 years ago, and the other day repainted the lettering for the first time since then. They've actually done this kind of work on a few barns, recently painting a similar ad on a barn in nearby Stafford. As for the Jello Barn, it is wonderful in all seasons. A barn beautifully maintained for some 204 years. In Genesee County, I'm John Kutchko.
Thanks, John. Well, from all of us at U.S. Farm Report, I'm Tyne Morgan. Thank you for joining us this weekend. Be sure to join us next week as we work to build on our tradition. Have a great weekend, everyone.
U.S. Farm Report is produced and distributed by Farm Journal Broadcast.